Hello there. Welcome to the Bon Appetit Test Kitchen. My name is Matt, and today we're going to talk about how to make your very own homemade animations with CSS and JavaScript. See, because it's Bon Appetit. But yeah, so today this is going to be pretty short. So if you're watching at home, you don't actually have to watch this one on 2x speed, but you still can. But I'm actually not going to recommend it because we're going to go over some timing stuff. So time is going to be kind of important here. But today, we're just going to talk about how to make things move on your web page. So far, everything we've designed has been static, right? There are text or images or columns or cards that we know that Peter doesn't like that appear on your website. So what we want to do is take that energy and let it move, let users interact with it. So today I'm going to go over how animations work very in brief, just enough so you have a working knowledge, and then introduce you to some libraries and importantly, how the pros do it. And I think that that knowledge is kind of important if front-end web development is something that you're interested in pursuing. So I usually don't do this, but I'm basically just going to read through kind of the content that I laid out in the notes. So very briefly, how do CS animations work on a very top level? The idea has to do with this thing called keyframes. So keyframes, this is a term that comes from like real animation and movie making, is basically you'll set a few locations or draw a few pictures of maybe the start, the middle, and the end of the animation. And it'd be really costly for you to draw out everything in between. So instead, you'll just draw the ones that are really important. And then after you've drawn those, you'll let the computer fill in the rest with some sort of mathematical function. And the easiest way to do it is just to equally distribute it. So if you imagine, right, if you're on like a chessboard or something, right, or like a 2D plane, and you have a point that goes from here to here, you know, you draw the 2 points and you say, hey, computer, connect them, and the computer just draws a straight line, right? And it'll animate your thing going across that straight line, across the time interval that you've defined. And there are more complex functions that we'll take a tour about in a moment. If that conceptually didn't make sense, hopefully the code will help you ground that in reality. So what does that actually look like? Here, this is some sample code that I have, and I'm going to bring your attention to this first block up here. So this is the most basic kind of CSS animation. Actually, this could be a transition. I'll talk about the difference between an animation and a transition later on. So if you notice here, we have this at. Let me just zoom in, actually, sorry. So we have this at. And this looks a little weird, right? Normally, we don't have ats in CSS. We haven't gone over these before. So this is like a rule or a top-level property or something. You can imagine as this kind of like declaring a local variable. And here, we're saying the type of this local variable is a keyframe, and its name is red to blue. So I named it well. So ideally, you should be thinking in your head, this is going to transition something from being red to blue. Inside the brace, we have 2 objects. And you can think of this thing kind of like being a selector, but instead of it being an element on the page, this is going to be a time. So the easiest ones are from and to. So it's very English, natural languagey, right? From something to something else. So in this case, if you notice, inside the from and the to, I've set values for the background color property, which we've already talked about before. And if you don't remember, the background color property just sets the background color of an element to be a certain value. So we're going to start from red, and it's going to go to blue. So far, does that make sense? We chilling? Great. Okay, so we have to now use this keyframe. So you can't just, this by itself is not enough to do an animation, okay? So I've made another thing called simple square, and I've made just a div that has the ID simple square. Here I refer to the div with the pound sign, which is a selector for an ID. And then I give it a width and a height just so you can see it on the screen. And then I say, hey, the animation name is going to be red to blue. So this is a new property we're introducing. And then its duration is going to be 5 seconds, another new property. And this is the most bare bone basic you need for an animation. A name that has the keyframes attached and a time. So far, making sense? Cool. So let's preview what this looks like on a page. So I'm going to refresh the page, and that's going to be when the animation actually starts playing. So I'm going to refresh. We start from red, then it fades through to blue, and then it's going to turn to black in a moment. So I'll come back to the black later. But for now, let's talk about the red to blue. So I'm going to play this animation again. And it's going to happen over the course of 5 seconds. I don't have a timer on my screen, but if you're watching this at 1x speed, notice the time in the video it takes to go from red to blue. Cool. So that's how an animation works. And you might now ask, Matt, what kind of properties can you animate? That's a great question, right? In general, you can animate any property that can take in a number value. So this, you're going to tell, well, Matt, what the heck? Red is not a number. Blue is not a number. But deep down, these are just shorthands for a number, right? In this case, this number is an RGB value. It's a tuple, but that's still a number, right? So similarly, right, the width or the height of something, that takes in a number, you know? Lots of other values like font size or, you know, any sort of color related thing, border thickness, all of these things take in value. So those work because you can scale them. However, some things don't take in numbers. Like for example, text align only takes in left, center, and right, and justify and inline and whatever. So you can't scale between center and left. So that doesn't work. But anything with a number works. So I just want to clarify that. That's how that's working out. And yeah, that's the most simple example that we have. I'm going to talk about the black thing in a moment, so don't worry about that for now. But in the meantime, I want to introduce a more complex animation. And in this case, we're going to use a feature of CSS called a CSS Transform. So a transform is transforming something. So, you know, Autobots, Decepticons, they're coming in. But really what you're doing is you're applying an operation to the entire element, okay? So there's a few CSS transforms. I think I included a link. So there's quite a few. This is the kind of stuff that you'd expect out of an image editor. So you can like scale things up, you can rotate them, you can skew them. You know, there's a lot of 3D transforms as well. This is really big if you do digital animation in websites. But for now, we're going to stick with a simple one called scale. So as you can imagine, scale scales your thing. So the name is a little indicative, but without actually looking at what this does, what does this keyframe look like it's doing? Question to the audience.
Looks like there's a couple different sizes that it's going through.
Exactly, Peter. Peter is always on top of his game. So if you notice here, scale is a numerical property. So as I mentioned earlier, right, we can only animate numerical properties. This takes in a number, so we're chilling. And this is actually shorthand. That's why this, just trust me that this is a number. So if you can see here, instead of from and to, we've now added percent symbols. So this is like the more explicit notation. If you think about it, from and to could be 0% of an animation completing to 100% of an animation completing. And the more numbers you add, right, the more complicated you can make your thing be. And in this case, we needed multiple numbers just because I chose so. We could have written this a lot simpler. So you notice from 0 to 25%, so a quarter of the animation duration, we go from a small thing to the normal size. Then we go back to it being small, then we go back to it being normal, and then it goes back to being small. Okay? How long is each of these iterations? Well, we can just look at the animation duration. And if you notice here, the animation duration is not encoded in the keyframe. The keyframe doesn't care how long the animation is. It's when you actually apply the animation that the duration gets specified. So that's an important thing. So sometimes you have to detach mentally, like this portion from this. But since this is 2 seconds, Peter, you're a math major. What is 1/4 of 2 seconds?
Half a second.
Genius. I know now why you get the big bucks. So we should expect that it takes half of a second for the heart to go from small to big, and then another half second to go from big to small. So in other words, in 1 second, the heart should go back to where it is. So again, we're going to take advantage that if you're watching this at home, this is a video. Take a look at this heart and actually time how long it takes to go from small to big. And you'll see that it's 1 second. Okay, so this is another example of CSS animations. These are both pretty simple. So these you can easily do by hand, and there's no really big problem there. These other two, by the way, are just to make it look good. You don't really have to do these for animations. But yeah, so this is the simple power of keyframes. And as I mentioned, you can animate tons of different kinds of things and properties. One last example that I'm going to briefly explain, but not really go into, is this one right here. So if I refresh the page, it's going to first underline, then expand. And then the text changes color. So I'm going to play that again. So sneakily, there are actually two different animations going on here. One is this black line. It's underlining, then expanding. And then the other is the text color. And if you slow down this video, I think you'll actually see the text switch to gray before or black, gray, white. If you view it like right now, it's a little hard to see. But you have to take my word for it. Slow down the video. How this works is we can layer animations and delay them on top of each other, right? So if you notice here, I've named the two animations. So one is whitening the text and the other is the underline itself, right? So I want it to, as we see, underline, expand, then transition. So what I can do is I can set the delays on these animations. I'm going to say, hey, we'll start the underline expand after 1 second, and the entire thing is going to take 1.5 seconds. So Peter, you're good at math. When should I start the other part, the color change? How long should the delay be there?
After the duration.
Exactly. So we do 1 plus 1.5, bam, 2.5, quick maths. We're both math majors. So this is really important because you can guarantee the order of animations to play. So if you want, a lot of stuff to happen on your page at once, you don't have to make it all one animation. You can stagger your different animations and have them play differently. One thing I'll notice here is that there's this this thing after. This is a pseudo element. We didn't talk about this. We're not going to talk about it because it's not super relevant. But if you're really into animation, I've included a link in the README. You can learn more about how this works. And this is mostly used for animation. Cool. And there's some other stuff too here, all animation related. Don't worry about it too much. There's also other just parameters you can change. So you can make it happen infinitely, right? This heart is beating infinitely versus these animations only played once. You can change the line fitting function. So this one I'm going to just show you very quickly. So when I mentioned this earlier, right, I said that there was an animation. I could have sworn I put in a Bezier curve thing. Oops, did I not? Sorry. Well, oh, yeah, okay. So I mentioned, right, if you mentally think of this animation as a line connecting two dots, and that's the position somehow graphed, right, you could draw a straight line. That's called a linear animation fill. But you can also use a different curve. And turns out there are these curves called Bezier curves that are just extremely popular for human interaction design. So you'll see a lot of these. There are tools that let you define your own curves and use them, and just something to keep in the back of your head. You can also do things like reverse the order of the animation or make it go front and then back, or all these different kinds of things. And I've included a link in the README so you can read up if you want to. But again, what I've just shown you is probably the extent of the animations that you'll use. Cool? Cool. Okay, very quickly, I want to talk to you about animation versus transition. So animation basically is a more powerful transition. So transitions only allow from to to, and they only allow a subset of things to happen. So you can't transition all different kinds of CSS properties that you can animate. So why the heck would you use transition? The short answer is that they're easier on your computer. So I'm not going to really go into when exactly you want to use them, because at the end of the day, for our purposes, it's probably going to be fine no matter what. But in the back of your mind, if you see documentation about transitions, you can think, oh, this can always be an animation. But it doesn't go the other way around. Not all animations can be transitions. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay, so these were easy examples that I wrote at 11 p.m. last night. Okay, but the web has way cooler animations. So I want to spend a little bit of time just to talk about how you can create more complex animations. And the first one, so I'm going to show you just two very quick examples. So look at this. This is like a pulsating sphere. I don't know if you can really see this that easily. And then this is like kind of just nuts. Like, look at this. Like, this is insane, right? And if I asked you to manually animate these keyframe by keyframe, it would probably take you several days, right? Which is nuts. That's not worth it. So there are other tools that you can use. And likely, if you include animations in your learning lab, you're going to probably use some of these tools. So I'll give you a quick demo of two different types of tools that you can use. So one type of tool is a JavaScript controller. And I'm going to show you anime.js. This doesn't have to do with like anime, sorry, or great, depending on where you lie on that spectrum. But anime.js is a JavaScript library that controls animations programmatically. So you can use these things like for loops and while loops and random generators and stuff like that. In my opinion, this is like one of the most nuts web resources that exists out there. Like this is insane. I don't know. I can't believe one person does this. But it's really cool. And they have a lot of really cool examples. It's really, really well documented. And they show you exactly how you can control tons of different animations, which is really great. And look at that, right? That's kind of nuts. Like, I can't believe you can do that in, you know, these many lines of code. Honestly, a lot of the stuff that anime does is like definitely overkill, but, you know, it's really useful. And I definitely recommend that you look into this if you really like CSS animations. The second thing I want to talk about is this thing. Oh, I'll just quickly show you one more example. So this example I was going to put in the README, but actually lags my computer because of how complex it is. And the file is too big. But look at this. Like, what the heck is this? You know, this is like something that you can only do with computers. And this is one of like the wonders of modern web design. And some websites have animations like these, which is really cool. But also one thing I'll say is that animations like these lag on slower computers. So just keep that in mind for your portfolio website. But look at that. That's so sexy. That's one option. JavaScript and CSS, probably the easier one out of the two I'm going to tell you. The other I'm going to tell you, this is really only relevant if you want to pursue a career in front-end web development, is the After Effects pipeline. So Adobe After Effects is this digital compositing motion graphics visual effects software made by Adobe. It's like the industry standard. Unless you make like literal movies, then you might use something else. But After Effects is nuts. The learning curve is insane. There's so much stuff you can do. But what you can do is you can digitally animate things in After Effects using its very advanced plugins, and then export them to CSS with extremely large CSS files using a library called Lottie, which is made by Airbnb. And Lottie is actually, it's used all the time in lots of phone applications that you'll use. So for little like micro interactions like these, it's really popular. And this is very hard to do with CSS because if you notice, right, this thing is being bent in a way that's very hard to describe, right? I don't know what CSS property you use to change that. So you animate in After Effects where you can, you know, use different tools, and then it does the math for you. And if you use Airbnb, you'll see Lottie all the time in these kinds of little animations that they have. So this is another way that people do it. And, you know, it's very, very popular, very common. And it's really cool. You can do a lot of cool things with it. But yeah, so in sum though, what did we talk about today in this very short video? Went over CSS animations. We talked about the very basics. This keyframe stuff is probably the extent that you're going to use animations. And I'll quickly just show you like a use case of like, okay, Matt, like why the heck would I use those animations in my app? Well, one example is micro interactions, right? Imagine if you have a button, you click the button, it shakes when there's a problem, right? That seems like a pretty good design pattern, right? Or you click on something and there's like a nice little thing that says, hey, you know, something is happening. So these kinds of interactions are the easiest and most reasonable for us to implement into our apps. But we also talked about some crazy shit or stuff, PG-13, that you can do with animations. It's really cool. Definitely I would check it out if it's something you're interested in. But yeah, that's it. I know this wasn't super interactive because it's really short and not that explanatory. But thank you for watching if you're at home. Really appreciate y'all. And as always, subscribe, comment below, give us feedback, read our notes, tell us what we did wrong. And if you're watching at home, on Monday, we're probably going to have our most important session so far, which is Intro to React. And we're going to talk about this front-end framework called React that we're going to use to build our learning labs. And if you're not watching this because of learning labs, React is also just a very good skill to know if you want to work in web development. But yeah, that's it. Thank you for watching. Catch you on the next one. Peace.